Spring, 1940. The fjords of northern Norway are locked in the pale gray light of an Arctic May, and the port of Narvik is collapsing. German bombers circle the ridgelines. Allied forces are pulling back. Ships are loading soldiers, not civilians. The order has come down. Stop the civilian evacuations. Prepare to withdraw. But one British sub-lieutenant looks at the thousands of Norwegian families still huddled in the shadow of the bombardment, and he does not stop. He has been told to leave them. He keeps moving them out. On the 9th of April 1940, Germany launched one of the most audacious operations of the war so far. Operation Weserübung was designed to seize Norway and Denmark in a single coordinated strike. Narvik mattered because of its ice-free port and its proximity to the iron ore mines of northern Sweden. During winter months, when Swedish ports froze over, Narvik was the only viable export point for the raw material that fed German steel production. Both sides understood the arithmetic. Control of Narvik meant control of a supply chain critical to the German war machine. When the invasion came, it came fast. On April 9th, major Norwegian ports from Oslo to Narvik were occupied by German advanced detachments. A single parachute battalion, the first ever deployed in combat, took the Oslo and Stavanger airfields. 800 aircraft overawed a country that had believed its neutrality would protect it. At Narvik, 10 German destroyers entered the harbor in darkness and heavy snow and sank the 2 Norwegian coastal defense ships before they could offer meaningful resistance. The harbor swallowed hundreds of Norwegian sailors in minutes. Allied troops began landing on April 14th, but the response was confused from the start. The naval and ground commanders received contradictory orders from London. The terrain was brutal, the supply lines were thin, and the Luftwaffe had air superiority over the fjords. For 2 months, Norwegian, French, British, and Polish troops fought German mountain soldiers and stranded Kriegsmarine sailors across snow-covered ridges and frozen passes that had never been mapped for military use. Into this campaign came a young sub-lieutenant who was unlike any officer the Royal Navy typically produced. Patrick Dalzel-Job was born in London in 1913. His father, an army captain, was killed at the Somme in 1916. After that, he and his mother lived in Motion, Switzerland, France, the coasts of Britain. He taught himself to ski in the Alps, taught himself to sail on a Swiss lake while studying navigation by correspondence course. He built his own schooner with his own hands. In 1931, he and his mother sailed it around the British coast. In 1937, they pointed it north toward Norway and spent the next 2 years exploring the fjords, islands, and channels of the Norwegian coastline. He was not a tourist. He made systematic studies of the coast, learned the weather patterns, memorized the harbors, befriended the people. He became fluent in Norwegian. He hired a young Norwegian girl named Bjørg Bangsund from Tromsø as crew. He was in his mid-20s. She was younger. It was not yet a love story, but it would become one, eventually, after the war had taken its time with both of them. In late August 1939, a radio broadcast persuaded him that war was coming, and he sailed home across the North Sea for the last time. On December 8, 1939, he was commissioned into the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. He was a junior officer among thousands at Scapa Flow, unremarkable on paper. But he carried something no one around him possessed: a language, a coastline, a network of relationships built over 2 years of peacetime sailing through the waters where the war had now arrived. When the Narvik campaign began, those things became indispensable. Dalzel-Job used his knowledge of the local coast to help plan Allied landings, earning praise from the Naval Task Force commander. He commandeered Norwegian fishing boats, the broad, slow Skøyter, and used them to transport elements of the 24th Guards Brigade ashore near Narvik and Bodø. In a campaign where every movement was difficult and every error was paid for in lives, he moved more than 10,000 Allied soldiers through those waters without losing a single man. 10,000 soldiers, not one lost. In fjords patrolled by German aircraft, in vessels built for fishing, navigated by a man working from memory and instinct, and a sailor's grasp of a coastline he had memorized years before. The war gave him a reason to. But the soldiers were only part of what Dalzel-Job saw. The civilians of Narvik and the surrounding fjord communities had been trapped since April. They were iron ore workers, fishermen, shopkeepers, teachers, mothers with young children who had no say in the strategic calculations of London or Berlin. As the weeks passed, the fighting only intensified around them. When French forces made an amphibious landing at Bjørkvik in May, the naval gunfire from supporting Allied warships destroyed most of the village and killed 14 civilians before the Germans were dislodged. Bjørkvik was not an exception. It was the pattern. When the guns fired, buildings burned, and the people inside them had nowhere to go. Dalzel-Job was not watching this from a distant ship. He was on the ground, on the water, among the villages, speaking to people in their own language. He had already helped organize earlier evacuations. He had already seen what German bombing did to towns that could not empty themselves in time. He understood, in a way the planners in London could not feel from their map tables, what was coming for Narvik. Then, in late May, the decision was made that sealed the city's fate. The Allied withdrawal from Norway, Operation Alphabet, was ordered on May 24, 1940. France was falling. The German blitzkrieg had torn through the Low Countries and was driving toward Paris. Dunkirk was days away. Every soldier, every ship, every rifle that could be freed from Norway was needed elsewhere. The final assault on Narvik on May 28th, which briefly recaptured the town, was not a victory. It was a screen, a deception operation to cover a withdrawal that was already decided before it began. The Norwegian government was told in early June. The news was met with disbelief and bitterness. Their army was still fighting. Their country was being abandoned. And in the narrowing window between the recapture of Narvik and the planned Allied departure, the question of the civilians sharpened into a crisis. When the Allied ships left, the German bombers would return. The town would be defenseless. The people still in it would be caught in whatever came next. The order came down the chain of command. Civilian evacuations must cease. Resources must be redirected to the military withdrawal. Ships were needed for soldiers. Time was needed for equipment. The people of Narvik were to be left where they were. By every standard reading of military procedure, it was a reasonable order. Wars are decided by logistics, not by sentiment. The calculus was unforgiving. Dalzel-Job looked at that order and saw something else. He saw the bombers that would come. He saw the families that could not move themselves. He saw a gap between what the order demanded and what the moment required. He was a sub-lieutenant. He had no authority over ship allocations, no seat at any planning table, no rank that would make anyone pause before overruling him. He had a language, a knowledge of the waterways, and the names of fishing boat captains who trusted him. And he had the conviction that compliance, in this particular moment, was not the same as duty. He did not file a protest. He did not seek permission. He did not wait for someone senior to take responsibility. He simply assessed the situation, the number of people still in danger, the fishing boats he had already used to move 10,000 soldiers, the routes through the fjords he knew by heart, the time remaining before the bombers came, and he decided. The order was wrong, not in theory, wrong in what it would cost. He turned back to the waterfront and kept loading boats. What followed was not glamorous. It was logistical. He organized departure points along the waterfront. He spoke to frightened families in Norwegian, telling them it was time to leave. He directed boats through waters still patrolled by German aircraft, still within range of the Luftwaffe, still carrying the chaos of a retreating army. Every movement carried risk. Women carried children. The elderly carried what they could manage. Some had never been in a boat. Some had never left Narvik. All of them were leaving behind everything they owned on the word of a British officer who told them, in their own language, that they had to go now. There was no formal infrastructure, no manifest system, no designated shelters at the other end. Dalzel-Job was improvising a humanitarian operation in the middle of a military withdrawal, using assets that had already been claimed for other purposes. Every boat he loaded with civilians was a boat unavailable for soldiers. Every hour he spent on the waterfront was an hour in direct violation of his orders. He did it anyway. Boat after boat. Family after family. The operation withdrew approximately 24,500 Allied troops between June 4th and June 8th. Into those 4 days, Dalzel-Job threaded his civilian evacuation, one boatload at a time, as the last Allied ships prepared to leave. When the Luftwaffe finally came for Narvik in earnest, the bombers found empty houses and vacant streets. The iron ore quays, the warehouses, the residential blocks, the shops where families had bought bread a week earlier. All of it was reduced to rubble and ash. But the people were not there. They were on the water, or already ashore at safe points along the fjord, because a sub-lieutenant had refused to stop loading boats. He saved approximately 5,000 Norwegians. Out of 5,000 people evacuated through active bombing, in open water, without authorization, only 4 died. 4. That number is not a statistic. It is the measure of how precisely and carefully the operation was conducted, and of the trust placed in him by the Norwegian fishing boat captains who sailed when he asked them to. The aftermath was almost predictable. He had defied a direct order. The chain of command does not look kindly on individual initiative that contradicts explicit instructions, regardless of the outcome. He was threatened with a court-martial. What saved him was a king, King Haakon VII of Norway, in exile in London, having watched his country abandoned by its allies, awarded Dalzel-Job the Knight's Cross of the Order of St. Olav in 1943. It is difficult to court-martial an officer whom an allied sovereign has personally decorated for the very act that forms the basis of the charges. Britain was hosting the Norwegian government in exile. It was relying on Norwegian ships, Norwegian intelligence, Norwegian cooperation. To punish an officer for saving Norwegian civilians, after the Norwegian king had publicly honored him for it, would have been an act of diplomatic self-destruction. The court-martial was quietly shelved, and Dalzel-Job remained in uniform. What followed was a wartime career that vindicated every instinct the Navy might have had about his judgment. He carried out commando raids along the Norwegian coast using motor torpedo boats. He trained on midget submarines. He completed parachute training. He joined the 30 Assault Unit Commando under Commander Ian Fleming, then personal assistant to the Director of Naval Intelligence, an elite unit formed specifically to seize enemy documents and ciphers before they could be destroyed. He landed at Utah Beach on D-Day +4 and worked ahead of the front lines, collecting intelligence from enemy positions in France and Germany. In 1945, he accepted the surrender of the German city of Bremen. Fleming later said that Dalzel-Job was one of the models for James Bond. Dalzel-Job himself had never read the novels and never saw the films. He had no interest in the fiction. He had lived the reality, and the reality had been enough. After the war, he went to Oslo and found Bjørg, the Norwegian girl from those pre-war sailing days, at Vestbanen train station. They married 3 weeks later. They had one son. Bjørg died in 1986. Dalzel-Job lived the rest of his years in a small house on the shore of a Scottish loch, far from the fjords, far from the war, but never entirely separated from either. He died at home in Plockton, Western Scotland, at the age of 90. He did not win a battle at Narvik. He did not capture a position or destroy an enemy asset. He loaded people onto boats. He spoke to them in their own language. He told them it was time to leave, and then he made sure they could. He did this in direct violation of his orders, at a moment when the full weight of military authority was telling him to stop. And because he did not stop, 5,000 people lived through a bombardment that would have killed them. That is the measure of what he did. Not a medal count. Not a body count. A life count. Measured in the families who eventually went home to a Norway that had been occupied and then liberated, because a quiet Englishman with a homemade schooner and a gift for languages decided that obedience had a limit, and that limit was the sound of bombers coming for a town full of people who had nowhere else to go.